All right. Well, hello and welcome to our next episode of the Leadership Crossroads. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about character and why personal character is important, why we should focus on it, how it ties into several other things, and then we're going to talk about some leadership traits that are helpful for a leader. Okay, so as we have already discussed in previous episodes, the way that we are defining leadership is the directing of behavior and actions of other people towards a goal or a mission through influence. And we took a deep dive previously on that definition of leadership and what that means. But the key word there is influence. So whether we're acting as a direct command and control situation where we're forcing people or making people do things, that is still influence. Or whether we're taking more of a coaching attitude towards leadership, then that is also influence. And as we discussed previously, John Maxwell cites a study in several of his books that even the most introverted person will influence over 10,000 people during the course of their lifetime. And the reason I mention that is just to say, as we've discussed previously, that by definition, this makes every single human being a leader. Therefore, it makes leadership one of the most important topics that we could ever talk about and work on and develop in our own lives. So that was a quick recap on how we're going to look at things. But let's start talking about how this notion of philosophy and stoicism fits in with character development, the four virtues, and so on. So if we look at the etymology of the word philosophy, so it comes from two parts. So the philos means love or fondness. If you are familiar with like Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, that's the same Greek word. So kind of a brotherly love or a fondness. And then Sophia means wisdom. And so the study or the pursuit of philosophy, or to be a philosopher, is one who loves in a brotherly fashion or is fond of wisdom. And so it literally means kind of the love of or the fondness of wisdom, right? The Stoics talked about how the pursuit of virtue, so they use the word virtue not necessarily in a religious sense, although it can certainly be used in that sense now that, 2,000 years later, we can think of it that way if we want to. But the pursuit of virtue, they also, another translation of that same word would be excellence. And so the pursuit of virtue could also be said of the pursuit of excellence. And if we think about the word excellence, so excellence kind of means to excel or to be above average. So the way that the pursuit of virtue was thought of, it was through the pursuit of the four cardinal virtues or the four kind of ways of excellence. And so if you think about it more of a modern sense, you have these character traits that kind of embody what it means to be excellent, to be an excellent human being, right? And so if we think about it from a leadership perspective, there are leadership traits that are under our control, that we have access to, that are inside us, that we can work on to develop and to hone and to make better over time, so that way we can become a more excellent leader and therefore a more excellent human being. So there's a great quote by way of kind of painting an introduction of why this is so important to us today as leaders. And there's a great quote that I like by Don Meyer, and he says, "It's easy to do right when you know ahead of time what you stand for." It's easy to do right when you know ahead of time what you stand for. And that's really a powerful statement there if you think about it. If you know that you want to be an excellent person, right, in the term that we just discussed, excellence, or the pursuit of virtue, be a virtuous person, then it's important to kind of know what you stand for ahead of time so that when situations come up, you can be thinking about it in such a way that you're ready, or you have an answer, or you know what you're going to do in those situations. You don't have to think about it in the moment. You know what you stand for, and therefore you can do what is right, what is virtuous, or what is excellent in that moment. And there's a really famous Stoic called Epictetus, and he wrote this Enchiridion, or basically a handbook. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the idea behind having a handbook of things that are, it's not terribly long, it's relatively short, and there's only a few things there. And it's kind of, the idea is to have things close at hand, right? The handbook, to have things ready so that you kind of, you know what to do, right? There's also a similar biblical sentiment about being ready and having an answer for people who would ask. So another great quote is attributed to several different people, but I believe it was originally from Malcolm Forbes. And it says, "You can easily judge the character of a person by how they treat those who can do nothing for them." You can easily judge the character of someone by how they treat those who can do nothing for them. And I think that's another great sentiment to begin to kind of think about our character or the pursuit of virtue. I've mentioned this quote already, but it fits in really well here. And this one has been attributed to many different people, so I just leave it as unknown. But it says, "Watch your thoughts, for they become words. Watch your words, for they become deeds. Watch your deeds, for they become habits. Watch your habits, they become character. Watch your character, because it becomes your destiny." So the idea behind character and character development is that it becomes a habit of who you are, and it becomes the trajectory of your life. There's a great quote by James Clear in his book Atomic Habits, where he says that every action you take is a vote towards the person that you're becoming. And so this is a really kind of building a case here for how our thoughts, our language, our words become actions, deeds, become our character, and become our destiny. And there's a very similar crossover or tie-in here with the lean philosophy of lean thinking, on how like very small incremental improvements add up over time and eventually become something big, right? And it's the discipline of doing the right thing, doing the basic things day in, day out, doing the boring things, doing the right things that build our habits and our character over time. Now, I've been asked before in various training about character traits or leadership traits, about like, do people just have them or they don't? Or like, are people born with them? Or like, if, like for example, one of the traits we're going to talk about is integrity. So do people just have integrity or they don't? And I think that all of us have these traits inside us, and it's a matter of us choosing to work on and develop these over time, right? It's a journey. And no one has arrived. No one has mastered all of the traits that we're going to talk about or all of the virtues. But it's about knowing what they are, first of all, and then doing something with that information, right? You got to know it, but know it is not enough. You got to actually work on it and do it. So let's talk about it a little bit. So one other thing that I think is interesting about Stoicism is how they believed that virtue or excellence was knowledge, and that vice, or the opposite of excellence, was ignorance. And so they kind of had this belief that, like, if you didn't embody one of the virtues, that was based on ignorance. And I think that's an interesting distinction to make, because that, we talk a lot about the respect for others and how we treat people. And so there's a great way to think about it, to say, okay, well, if someone is not embodying one of the virtues or one of the traits that we're going to talk about, it's because they don't know that they need to be doing that. And seeing that as ignorance allows us to be the coach, to be the trainer, to be the mentor, and help them with that, instead of maybe dismissing them. Now, it doesn't excuse bad behavior, right? There's still consequences, and there still needs to be consequences for bad behavior. But I'm talking about taking more of a coaching perspective and thinking about how people are going about their lives and how they're embodying these virtues, and how it's ignorance. They don't know that they need to be doing it, right? And so the way you see people is the way you treat them, and the way you treat them is the way they become. And by thinking about it in that perspective, it changes how we act and interact with other people, I think. So there's a great quote from Marcus Aurelius in Meditations 2:1, where he talks about, like, and remember, Meditations is like his own notes to himself. It was never intended to be a book for other people to read. And he's telling himself, remember that you're going to meet people who are, and then he lists a bunch of negative things. People are ignorant, are trouble, are bothering you. And he lists a bunch of these different things. And then he says, don't forget that these people are your brothers, right? That these people are people just like you. And in some cases, I'm inferring a little from that statement there, but the way I can see him sitting there thinking, like, some people are seeing this about me, like they're thinking that I'm a problem, and they're thinking that I'm annoying and troublesome. And so he's basically saying, like, don't forget you're going to meet people that are going to bother you, but they're people just like you, and they act this way out of ignorance. And he's kind of reminding himself this important knowledge versus ignorance, for virtue versus vice, and saying, like, it's your job to help these people, right? He was the emperor, and he was kind of, like, it's your job, right? It's your job to help these people. They're going to bother you, but they're bothering you out of ignorance. And I thought that was a really interesting thing to throw in there. So at the one of the most famous phrases at the temple in Delphi, or the Delphic temple there, they had this statement up on the wall that said, know thyself. And this is a very common thing for people to think about and talk about, know thyself. In fact, in the Marine Corps, it's one of the leadership principles. It's the first one, to know yourself, seek self-improvement. Because you can't work on yourself, you can't help yourself get better if you don't know yourself and know your strengths and know your deficiencies. So I think the important thing, as we start to think about and talk about the virtues and the traits, is kind of knowing ourselves, and kind of thinking about where am I strong and where am I weak, and then working on both, right? Our strengths will always be our strengths, but we can work on our weaknesses, right? So a lot of people don't realize that the serenity prayer actually comes from Stoicism. So if you're not familiar with the serenity prayer, it says, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So what they're talking about there is actually something that we've touched on already, but we're going to continue to think about, is what's called the dichotomy of control, or some call it the trichotomy of control. So there's kind of the things that we control, the things that are outside of our control. And then for the trichotomy, it's things I control, things that I influence, and then things that I do not control. And so in the Enchiridion, the Epictetus says, and this is the AA long translation, there's several different translations, but very famous from Epictetus, he says, and this is a quote, "Some things in this world are up to us, while others are not. Up to us are our facilities of judgment, motivation, desire, and aversion. In short, everything that is our own doing. Not up to us are our body, our property, our reputation, our official positions. In short, everything that is not our own doing." So this is a really interesting statement from Epictetus. What is up to us and what is not up to us? So things that we control, our attitude and our actions, right? Like he says, our desire and our aversion, our motivation, our judgments. So these are things that we control. What we don't control are things that are outside of our control. And he lists some things like what other people think of us, our health, the things that we own. These things are not under our control. And he talks about how if it's not our own doing, right, it's not under our control. Now, if we extend that to be the trichotomy of control, is maybe a slightly more modern take on the dichotomy of control, there's the things that you influence, right? So some things that you influence, like if you're a leader, right, and we said we're all leaders, you influence other people on a daily basis. You don't control what they think or what they do, but you do influence them for the good or for the bad. And like we talked about before with leadership capital, every interaction, you're either putting money into that account or you're taking money out of that account. So we need to be thinking about that. Are we building our leadership capital, or are we withdrawing? But something that is under our control is our character. And our character, because that's our attitude and our actions, right? And so our character is under our control. So what's interesting about focusing on character is that because it's under our control, we can actually change our actions or our attitude in any given situation and see immediate results. So Donald Robertson talks about that a lot. And I really like his thoughts on that, where he's like, you can do something about your attitude and your actions and see immediate results, right? So if you're in a job, you don't control the market, but you control your actions and your attitude, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about that here shortly. So if we focus on things within our control, then we can take positive steps forward. If we're focused on things that we have no control over, well, that's going to be very difficult for us to see immediate results, or see any results even sometimes. And then if we focus on how we can positively influence those around us and we make that our goal, then we can kind of stack the deck in our favor, although it won't always work out, but we're putting that positive spin or that positive influence on our actions, our thoughts, our attitude, and our character. So I hope you can see where I'm going there. So we talked about the Enchiridion, and we talked about how focusing on things that are up to us or our own doing is where we're going to see positive benefit. And so again, I'm still kind of building this case here for focusing on character, on excellence, and on our leadership traits and principles that we're going to talk about here shortly. So even from a biblical perspective, we can look at things like, in Philippians, Paul talks about learning to be content in all situations. Or in Matthew, they talk about how not worrying about material needs and not worrying about things that aren't under our control. Very similar sentiment. So in the theme of the Stoic view, we have the 4 cardinal virtues. So the 4 cardinal virtues, or the 4, you could rephrase that to be like the 4 areas of excellence, right? The first one is wisdom, and that's known as the chief virtue, the pursuit of wisdom. The second one is courage, then justice, and then temperance. And we'll talk about the 4 here in just a second, but just quickly to say, why do they call them the cardinal virtues? They call them the cardinal virtues because it comes from the Latin word cardo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct, but it means the hinge or the pivotal or the essential ideas, right? Or the essential virtues or the essential or pivotal points of excellence. And so another interesting side note is that although these were first at least the writings we have now, they come from Plato, but they were, Socrates talked about it as well, but later were incorporated into the Christian tradition with theologians like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and various other people who continue to expound upon and add to the 4 cardinal virtues, and they kept them the same. So it's very, very interesting. So wisdom being the first one, there's clear crossover or tie-ins with the biblical stories like of Solomon being the most wise man, wisdom being a very key difference to something like knowledge. So knowledge is just a knowing or understanding something. Wisdom is different, right? There's that funny saying about like, if knowledge was all that it took, everybody would be rich and have 6-pack, right? So you have a difference between just knowing something and being able to know and deeply understand and be able to implement and be able to just have that wisdom. So I kind of phrased it as like knowing what to do and doing it in a given situation, right? There's a million definitions of wisdom, but kind of the knowing and the doing is kind of the wisdom. Knowing what the rules are, knowing when to break them, knowing when they apply, when they don't apply, when to do certain actions, when to have patience, when to take action. There's a lot of things that wisdom ties into. So some alternate words that you could use for wisdom in this sense is kind of the having insight or discernment, having sound judgment, having understanding, or even the word prudence, right? So these are alternate terms for wisdom, right? To increase our understanding of the first virtue. So it's known as the chief virtue, and like there's a story from Socrates, who was famous for his wisdom pursuit and asking people at random about wisdom. And he's talking about he was talking with some generals about courage, and we'll talk about courage in a moment, but he was talking about that and saying like, what is courage? And they were kind of giving him different definitions about like, oh, it's, facing the enemy and standing and fighting. And then he was kind of like, well, surely there's situations where it's more advantageous to do a tactical retreat and come at it from a different direction. And there's a time and a place for that. Or, maybe there's a different type of, like maybe infantry is different from cavalry and they're on horseback and their tactics are a little different. So they might not stand and fight. They might run and circle around and come from behind and stuff. And so they agreed with him. And so this is kind of what I mean by wisdom. It's not just like one thing. It's you kind of have different definitions and looking at things from different angles and knowing what to do and doing it. So you could say that kind of the pursuit of virtue or excellence is actually wisdom. And wisdom is kind of giving you the areas of pursuit to kind of look at and focus on. And you could say really, even in a business situation, that it's very much the same, right? You want to have wisdom in your decision making. You don't want to just make rash decisions or fly off the handle or, make emotional decisions. You want to kind of have that balance or that wisdom, right? Okay. Knowing what to do and doing it in a given situation. So next is justice. So justice is they mean it a little bit differently than we think of it today. We think of it as like law and order in the justice system, at least in the United States. And that's certainly a part of it, but that's not the entirety of what they mean by justice. So I mentioned this already in a previous episode, but Stoicism, the modern take on it is that it's just this unemotional, stiff upper lip, like nothing bothers me and I'm not, but that's really not what it means at all. And that's not what any of the Stoics believed in or thought or how they treated other people. So we kind of say the Stoicism with the uppercase S is the actual philosophy and the lowercase s is kind of the meaning of the modern, thinking of like, oh, that person was acting stoic, meaning they were like unemotional, like Spock from Star Trek or whatever it was. But so what they mean by justice, so justice is kind of the conduct or the treatment, like how you conduct yourself or the treatment or respect for other people. It incorporates things like integrity, equity, empathy, kindness, right? There's a number of references in many Stoic texts to things about those things: integrity, kindness, treatment of other people. Thinking, like we just talked about the one from Marcus Aurelius where he's talking about these people are your brothers. Don't be annoyed by them. Like treat them with respect and help them, right? So it's a very different way of thinking of the word justice than kind of a modern take. But I guess you could kind of sum up justice by just how we treat other people. Is it right? Is it just? Is it kind? Is it with empathy? These are important things to be thinking about and why it's one of the cardinal virtues or key aspects of the pursuit of excellence. The next one is courage. And we're going to talk about courage a couple more times, but in the sense of the four cardinal virtues, it could also be translated as like bravery, grit, fortitude, moral strength, right? These are alternate translations for the word courage. The way you could kind of sum it up would be like doing the right thing, even when nobody's looking. So this is kind of where the not just physical bravery or kind of the typical superhero bravery kind of thing. It's not really, it could be that if that situation came up, but it's not only that. It's more about the moral strength, the internal doing the right thing. That's really what it's talking about. And then the last one of the four virtues is temperance. And so temperance could also be translated as like moderation or self-control or discipline or even balance. And so when we talked about the Delphic Temple saying of know thyself and how that comes back around to even modern things like the Marine Corps traits and principles, but also a second saying at that temple was nothing in excess, or as we would say it kind of now, everything in moderation, right? So very like, common wise saying like maybe Ben Franklin would say or something like that, right? And so having moderation, self-control, or balance is a really interesting tie-in to the Extreme Ownership series from Jocko Willink and how he talks about discipline equals freedom and how having the discipline to eat right or to exercise gives you the freedom to make exceptions to those rules, and or the discipline to do the right thing every day in your business process gives you a lot more freedom than just allowing everybody to do whatever they want. Like, sticking to a process is one of the key aspects of lean manufacturing or lean thinking. So really all these tie in really well together. As we said from the beginning, it's really interesting to see these crossovers or these cross points or tie-ins. So basically you could say for temperance or discipline that it's prioritizing and focusing on what's important, right? So that's kind of an interesting way to think of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. So there's this story called the Stoic Archer. And basically what the Stoic Archer is a story that talks about how in archery or shooting a bow and arrow, let's look at that and see what is under our control and what is not under our control. And it kind of illustrates the point. I thought it really was a good analogy, even still to this day, for what we're talking about. So basically it says that the archer it controls his intent. He controls whether he does his best. And then he controls when he fires the arrow, right? So there's things that are under his control. Like, he decides his intent is, yes, I'm going to shoot the bow and arrow. Next is that I'm going to do it to the best of my ability, and based on his experience and practice and the condition of his equipment, et cetera, that all impacts that. But he decides that he's going to do his best. And then when he fires the arrow, he decides when he's going to release the arrow. What's not under his control is the wind or any other factor that's going to cause the arrow to miss the target. Like, maybe there's a branch in the way, or maybe he's hunting and the target moves. So when you think about it, what he controls is his intent and firing the arrow, but he doesn't control whether or not the arrow actually hits the target. And so that part of it is outside of his control. So if the archer's goal is to hit the target, well, there'll be times when he does, and he's going to be happy about that. But there's going to be a lot of times when he doesn't. And so if his, identity or self-worth or whatever is tied up around hitting the target, he doesn't really have control of that. And there's going to be a lot of disappointments along the way. But if his intent is tied up around doing his best and he's focused on the process of firing the arrow, then he can execute with excellence every time and be satisfied and happy with what he's doing. There's a great book, short book called Chop Wood and Carry Water. And this is a key theme behind that book as well, where if you're focused on winning in a game, well, there's going to be plenty of times where you don't win, right? Or winning in business or in your personal life or whatever the case may be. But if you're focused on character and virtue or excellence and how you're treating other people, are you doing your best? Are you focused on the process? Are you focused on the things that you control? Well, you can actually have direct effect right now and see those effects and actually win every time if that's what you're focused on. So this is similar to the principle of, it's not whether you win or lose, it's how you play the game, right? You've all heard that about sportsmanship and kind of learning about, there's lessons to learn when you fail, right? And certainly there are, but it's more about how you play the game. If you're focused on, winning, a tennis match or whatever kind of game you're playing, you're not going to always have control. You don't have control, right? The other person might be further along in their journey. They might have more experience than you. But if you're focused on playing with excellence, then you can do that every single time. It's also similar to focusing on it's about the journey and not the destination, right? That sort of old wisdom saying. It's also similar to focus on the process, right? In quality management or lean thinking, there's a lot of discussion around focusing on process. If you want to change the outcome, you change the process. But you can't just think like focusing on the outcome is going to make any difference, right? Deming, the father of quality management, statistician, he would always say this: outcome is because every outcome is because the process has been perfectly designed to get you that outcome, right? Every process has been perfectly designed to get the output that it's currently getting, right? So if you're not happy with the outcome, you got to change the process. But you can't change the outcome by just hoping and wishing and trying. You have no control over that, but you do have control over process. So this ties in really well with Stoic Archer, right? The archer's process of firing the arrow, that's what he has control over, and his intent to do his best, but he doesn't have control over whether he hits the target or not. Once that arrow leaves that bow, it's out of his control. So you could apply wisdom to the process, right? And applying wisdom to the process of so because wisdom is the chief virtue, you can apply wisdom to each of the virtues, right? So the pursuit of wisdom in and of itself is important for various reasons, but we also would want to apply wisdom, let's say, to justice, right? So how we treat other people, developing our relationships, developing our organizational culture, the company culture, and society around us, right? That is applying wisdom to justice, right? So there's a great book about safety leadership that's called Alive and Well at the End of the Day. And one of the things that it talks about there is that every organization has a culture, right? Because there's a lot of talk about company culture and how do you develop company culture? How do you get the culture that you want? And he says, you have a culture, right? It's not necessarily the one that you want, but it's the one that you have, right? It's the one that you deserve because it's the one that you have. It's the one that you've gotten because of the actions that you've taken, right? The process is giving you a result. If you want a different culture, you have to have a different process, right? And so the organizational culture, having wisdom, is developing relationships with people in our organization, in our families, etc. Doesn't just happen. And if you want it to be different, you got to do something different. Same thing with courage, right? You can apply wisdom to courage, where doing the right thing when no one is looking, this is kind of applying wisdom is kind of knowing when things apply, when they don't apply, the difference between fairness and equity, right? That's wisdom, being able to know the difference there. And then kind of knowing what hill to die on, right? Picking your battles. Some things are worth dying on that hill for, but not many, right? So wisdom is kind of knowing and picking battles and knowing like, hey, this really isn't all that important. I'll just go with their idea because their idea, maybe it's better, maybe it's not better, but it's not worth dying on that hill or spending any leadership capital. But maybe something is, very unpopular, but it's the right thing to do. And maybe that is a hill to die on, right? But wisdom is kind of knowing the difference there. So that's how you can kind of think about applying wisdom to courage. And then temperance, remember, this is also self-control, discipline, balance. Applying wisdom to temperance is kind of that long-term thinking, strategic thinking versus tactical thinking, feeling pleasure right now versus long-term health and happiness and success, right? So you can see there's a lot of applications where that applies in business, in our personal life, with our family. What's easy right now is probably not the right solution. Being disciplined and focused on the good, right? So there's a pursuit of the good or pursuit of what is excellence. Very common thought process in Stoic thinking. And having balance and knowing that going too hard in any direction is not good, right? Going too hard on discipline, not good, right? Going not enough on discipline, not good, right? There's a balance there. So that's temperance. That's that moderation. So even good things, if you do too much of them, are usually can develop into bad things, right? So this is kind of the tie-in between Stoic Archer, wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, and things that are under our control, things that are not under our control. So I hope this is kind of a good introduction to start talking about leadership traits. All right, so as we're getting into talking about the character traits, there's one more thing I wanted to mention, and that's kind of a sentiment that I learned from Jordan Peterson, where he talks about not comparing yourself to other people, but comparing yourself to yourself. So I compare myself to who I was yesterday and trying to be better today than I was yesterday. And if you compare yourself to other people, again, you don't control other people, right? They're outside of your control. You don't know how long they've been working on those skills or those things that you think they're better at you than you are. It's kind of like going for a run and then seeing someone else running and like trying to catch up with them and like spending energy on that. Like, you don't know how long that person's been running. Maybe they just came around the corner and they literally just started and you've been going for 10 miles. You know, catching up with them means nothing in that moment, right? They may have just started, or they may be, in a, Olympic level runner, like, you don't know where they're at in their journey. All you know is where you are. And so not comparing yourself to someone else, compare yourself to yourself. This is really important life advice because, again, we got to focus on ourselves, on our process, so that we can help other people, but so that we can improve ourselves, be more excellent, be more virtuous. And it's important, like other people, no one's arrived, and other people are at various places in their journey, and thinking about it as, another Peterson thing is like treating yourself like you would treat a close friend that you were coaching, right? And not treating yourself negatively, like, oh, I just suck at this, right? Treat yourself like a close friend that you're trying to help and give advice to, not comparing yourself to other people, but trying to just be a little bit better each day. And focusing on things that you can control is the best way you can do that. All right, so let's take a look at the leadership traits. So when we say trait, this is sort of an individual personal characteristic. So later we're going to talk about leadership principles, but leadership traits are things that are like something that we control, something that is like a personal characteristic, things like loyalty, courage, wisdom. These are things that we control. A principle, a leadership principle, is sort of a lens, an assumption, a doctrine that you follow, a lens that you look at the world through, a code of conduct, that sort of thing. So principles, slightly different than traits. We'll talk about both. The traits that we're going to talk about today come from the Marine Corps leadership training, and they have this acronym that they use, JJ did tie buckle. And JJ did tie buckle is just a way, it's an acronym to remember the leadership traits by. So the ones that we're going to talk about are in that order: JJ did tie buckle, judgment, justice, decisiveness, initiative, dependability, tact, integrity, endurance, bearing, unselfishness, courage, knowledge, loyalty, and enthusiasm. Okay, so let's start with the first one, which is justice. So remember, we just talked about justice. Justice is the the first one here, it is also one of the four cardinal virtues. So it's kind of got the double importance here. So justice, in the sense of J.J. did tie buckle, is sort of the quality of displaying fairness, impartiality, consistency with our team members. So this is things like having a set of principles. It does also include things like being, adhering to the law, sort of the administration of punishment, reward. It incorporates things like truth and honesty. Being just and equitable is what justice is all about. And in the sense of the way that the Marine Corps leadership training sets the stage for it, justice is kind of the foundation or the fundamental trait that everything else is built off of. Now, you could argue pretty much any of these traits as being the foundation, but in the sense that they're explaining it, justice is the foundation. Employees will respect fairness, impartiality, and consistency when dealing with situations, even if they don't agree. So the reason why this is so important is that, if there's a work situation where someone is doing a great job and someone else that's working there is not doing a great job, there's kind of a sense of, well, we're both getting paid the same amount. Now I'm working really hard and that person isn't even trying. Like, why should I continue to bust my hump when that person's getting paid the same amount? So having that sense of justice, fairness, impartiality, and consistency, or treating different situation or similar situations similarly in regards to the administration of punishment or reward, either way, is super important. Now, to that person that has that question to their supervisor or their mentor or whoever about why should I bust my hump when that person over there is not doing a great job, first of all, that's a great conversation starter to have a little bit of a mentorship moment with that person and say, look, you don't control what other people do. You only control what you do. So if you are doing a great job, nothing that anyone else does around you should impact you doing a great job, right? The leadership team will deal with the person who is not doing a good job, but we need you to focus on continuing to do the right thing. And from a professional development standpoint, that's a really great conversation to have. Some really good advice that I was given early on in my career was, you don't have to soar with the eagles as long as you're not down with the turkeys, right? Meaning that, you don't have to be the best, right? But you don't want to be at the bottom. You don't want to be the one that's not trying, that's not doing well, right? You just need to be working, doing your best, and not focused on, are you the best, are you the worst? Just focus on doing a good job. And really, especially in the workplace today, there's a lot of people that put in very minimal effort. So if you want to succeed, if you really actually try and do your best, you will be far, far ahead of those people who are putting in minimal effort or less, right? So really great coaching moment to have with somebody. You got to deal with the people who are underperforming. And the longer that you let that go unchecked, the less justice, so to speak, is there, right? And that sense is really going to eat away at the team, not just because of the underperforming side, but just on the straight up unfairness of the situation. It's interesting that holding people to a standard has such an important factor in how the team feels about the team, their morale, the way that they see their job. When they know that if somebody doesn't do what's expected of them, that there will be consequences, that is actually good for morale. People want to see that because most people, like I said, most people come to work wanting to do a good job. And if they come to work wanting to do a good job and they do a good job, they want to know that that expectation is there from other people, and everybody wants to be on a winning team. And the only way to get there is to get everybody above that minimum standard. And so having fairness, impartiality, and consistency, that is, in the cardinal virtues stance, how we treat other people. And that's super important. That's the foundation. So the next J in the JJ part of JJ did tie buckle, number 2, is judgment. So what's the difference between justice and judgment? Well, justice is, like I said, the sort of the standard, and judgment is sort of the applying of the standard. So the way we say judgment is the ability to think things through clearly and calmly in order to make good, sound decisions. That's having good judgment. So some alternate words or phrases you could use to think about judgment. One would be wisdom, right? You could argue that this would be the wisdom of the 4 cardinal virtues. But it's also things like having objectivity, discretion, maybe even some common sense, the ability to make a decision, make an informed decision, or things like prudence or reasoning. So judgment is kind of like taking that information and making a decision through the lens of justice that we just talked about. So this is like avoiding rash and emotional decisions. And poor judgment leads to bad decisions. And this is often obvious to coworkers, peers, team members, and your leadership. So having good judgment allows you to make good and sound, informed decision. And again, this is kind of knowing what things are appropriate in what situations. We'll talk about that later in another trait, but this sort of thing builds trust by having good judgment in the workplace. So you're taking all the things that we built up with justice and you're applying it to a situation by making a decision or making an action. And so this is why judgment and justice are the beginning of the leadership traits and principles. And hopefully that makes sense why that ties in so well with wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. So it's kind of the decision-making process by using the lens of justice. The next one is decisiveness. So decisiveness is the first D in did. So we got JJ did tie buckle. Decisiveness is the quality of weighing all the information available in the circumstance and making a prompt and timely decision. So just like with judgment, decisiveness is taking all of that stuff that we've talked about, the fairness, the equitability, the standards, using good judgment, and then being decisive, taking the information that you have in the moment and making a prompt and timely decision. This is why leadership is so important. This is why we need managers and leaders, is to make decisions, to make judgment calls, right? And so some alternate words you could use is, resolution or resolute, being determined, being definite, having resolve or having purpose, being assertive or being firm. The decisiveness is taking what you know and making a decision. This is like we always joke, why we get paid the big bucks is to make these calls, right? But the thing is that because everybody's a leader, everyone is making decisions every day, lots of decisions. I mean, when do I wake up? Do I drive this way or that way? What am I going to eat? Like every decision you make, you're using decisiveness. So a leader who can't make a decision is not able to lead other people, right? You remember, because we're guiding their actions towards an end, and people are going to have questions and we're going to need to make decisions. And so being decisive is really important. But here's the deal. Don't let perfection get in the way of progress. So using the information available in the circumstances, the key phrase there. No decision that you ever make are you going to have all the possible information that you could ever have about that decision. It's just never going to happen. Some people will want to wait until they have all the information before they make a decision. And although their heart's in the right place by wanting to have all the information, you're never going to have all the information. So making a prompt and timely decision is what leadership is all about. Now, obviously, there's a scale here, right? There's a sliding scale of how important is the decision, what are the implications here, and, is there a lot of, cost? Is there a lot of money on the line? Is someone's life on the line? Is this a really important decision? Is this a very minor decision, right? There's a sliding scale there. But it's important to know ahead of time so that you're not surprised that things are going to come up where you're not going to have all the information. And so where we talked about the safety, quality, flow, or process, and then waste as kind of a flow chart in a previous episode for how do we make a decision, that's a great way to think about business decisions in such a way that allows you to explain why you made that decision. And it's a relatively quick process that you can go through to figure out that information. So it's important to make decisions. Now, one thing that Jocko talks about is making, he calls it default aggressive or taking action, right? Having a bias for action is a more business way of saying it, bias for action. And when he says default aggressive, he's not talking about being aggressive towards people. He's talking about being aggressive in action, taking action. And that's decisiveness. And when you have a bias for action, it's important. Jocko talks about that you make small decisions that still leave you ways to pivot. So if you take a step, it allows you to pivot and go a different way. And we've talked previously about having flexible plans or simple plans that are flexible because no plan survives first contact, right? So you have to have these flexible thought patterns that say, if I make this decision, will it give me the option to change it or slightly change it or drastically change it as the case may be? So if you continue to make iterative, small progress decisions, you're taking action and moving towards a goal, but you're still leaving yourself a little bit of wiggle room so you don't paint yourself in the corner with a big decision that leaves you off to one side. Now, sometimes you do have to make those big decisions, but that's why it's important to not let perfection get in the way of progress. Okay, so the next one is initiative. So the initiative is the I in DIDS, in JJ Did Tie Buckle. Initiative is the principle of understanding the mission or the goal or the outcome you're trying to get to and taking action in the absence of instructions. So initiative is essentially taking action in the absence of instruction, seeing and understanding what needs to be done and doing it without being told. The initiative, I always say, is my favorite of the leadership traits out of JJ Did Tie Buckle, because it was something that was very important that I learned early on. And I always share the story of I had a leader very early in my career that took me aside one day, and it was maybe a 3-minute conversation. It was not long. Maybe it was even less than that. And he said basically, hey, you're really good about like doing what we are asking you to do, but you're not taking any initiative. And initiative is kind of knowing what needs to be done and doing it without being told. And he's like, if you want to go far in your career, you're going to need to take initiative. And I was like, wow. And it was a light bulb moment for me that I'll never forget. And that's why I say it's my favorite, because I think that a lot of young people or people maybe younger in their career than you are need to have somebody in their life have that conversation with them. It's not just enough to do what is asked of you in the workplace, right? Anybody could do that. And that's really not what we want. I hear leaders sometimes say, like, man, I wish people would just do what I told them to do. No, you really don't. You want people to be free thinking, problem solving, initiative taking leaders. Why? Because you're not going to be there every second of every day, standing over their shoulder, telling them every little thing to do, right? They're going to need to make decisions and solve problems in your absence. And so you don't want people to just do what you tell them to do. You want them to understand the mission, understand what you're trying to accomplish, what their role is, understand their parameters of where they can operate, right? The goalposts that they can operate between. And you want them to take that and run with it, right? You want them, they're going to take action and do things and solve problems that maybe you couldn't even solve on your own, right? So initiative is so important to talk about in the workplace, whether it's a toolbox talk, whether it's a quick coaching conversation, whatever it is. Have those conversations with people because, first of all, in order for them to take initiative, they have to understand the mission or the goal of the organization, the team that they're on, and their roles and responsibilities. We'll talk more about that when we get to the Gallup stuff, but those things are critical for the person to understand. Otherwise, they cannot take initiative. If they don't understand what's going on or what the overarching goal is or what's trying to be accomplished on the team that they're working on and with and for, that should be your first goal as a leader, is to explain all of that stuff to the new people or to people that have been there for a long time, to continue to reinforce those things. And then rewarding people taking action, even if they make a mistake. We used to have a phrase in the military, we'd say like, oh, good initiative, bad judgment. So we'd say like, yeah, I'm happy that you made a decision and did something. You did the wrong thing, but I'm glad that you went down that road, right? Because we can always continue to coach and train and fix those things, but it's a lot harder to train and coach initiative than it is. So like, it's always easier to pull the reins back than it is to get somebody to move faster, right? So if you've got that go-getter person that's always taking the initiative, that's what you want. You can always pull the reins back a little bit, but it's really hard to get people going. So explaining how important initiative is super critical. So some alternate words or phrases for initiative are things like taking leading action, being ready, seizing opportunity. Other terms are like energy or moxie or vigor, right? These are things that you want people to have and you want to reward them. But again, you got to explain it to them. Just like with all of these leadership traits, no one is good at all of them. Some people are naturally better at some than others, but everybody would benefit from discussing all of these at various times throughout their career. So have these coaching conversations with people. Taking advantage of presented opportunities avoids lost opportunity, and nobody wants to be micromanaged. So we talk about not micromanaging a team. Nobody likes to be micromanaged. And if you're currently being micromanaged, the best way to avoid a little bit of that micromanagement is to be the king of taking initiative. Because if you know that your boss wants something done in a specific way at a specific time, and he's always, nagging about it, well, if you just go ahead and do it ahead of time, quicker than he expected, under budget, whatever the case may be, you're going to avoid micromanagement. Now, don't be a micromanager and train people to take initiative. Just because it happened to you doesn't mean it needs to happen to other people. But it's a great piece of advice if someone is micromanaging you, is to take the initiative, go above and beyond expectations. Now, this is not everybody is going to love taking initiative. So if you want your team members to take initiative, you might want to think back in the past and see, have they ever been punished for taking initiative? And if they have, you need to address that before you start encouraging people taking initiative. because you can only shut people down for so long before they just stop taking initiative. Remember, this goes back to our company culture, and we get the one that we deserve, not the one that we would love to have. So if people are constantly being told like to stay in their lane, or their ideas are being shut down, or anything like that, they're not going to take initiative on their own. But again, be the example, be the change you want to see, show them initiative, talk about initiative, and it'll start to happen. But again, explain what the mission is and what their goalposts are. If their budget is that they can spend up to $500 without asking, then you need to be okay when they do that, right? But it gives them a little bit of a guideline. They're not spending 10 grand without asking, right? So I hope that makes sense with setting the boundaries and then telling them to run with it. Okay, the next one is dependability. So the second D in did, dependability. JJ did tie buckle, dependability. Okay, the quality of the individual to be relied upon to accomplish tasks or duties without supervision. So it's that. And then the second part is willing and voluntary support of policies and instructions of the company or one's leadership. So there's two sentences there that we'll address separately. So the quality of the individual to be relied upon to accomplish tasks or duties without supervision. So dependability is probably one of the most important ways that you would describe someone who works with or for you to someone else. You'd say, oh, yeah, here's Bob or here's Sally. They do a really good job for me. They're really dependable, right? It's usually one of the words that somebody would say if they were really happy with someone on their team that they trusted, that was doing a good job, and so on. So the quality to be relied upon and do things without supervision, being dependable. Like I don't have to tell them to be on time to work. They're just always on time, right? Even something as simple as that is going to set you apart from the people who are doing minimum expectations. Being dependable. That's a really important thing to be thinking about. Am I like being dependable in a given situation? Can people count on me, right? Is the way to kind of know myself, right? So some alternate words or phrases are like worthy of trust, reliable, capable, respectable, loyal, level-headed, right? These are dependability. So dependability builds trust. It takes a lot of time to build trust, and you can lose it really fast. But being dependable is a great way to start building trust with the people around you. Now, that's the first part of dependability. The second part is the willing and voluntary support of the policies and instructions of the company and leadership team. This is a tricky one. So when you're part of the leadership team and you have a team of people that work for you, there's going to be policies, SOPs, procedures. There's going to be leadership decisions that you don't agree with, but you are responsible for rolling out or implementing or things like that, right? So it's a tricky situation to be in. And the worst thing that you can do, and I've seen this time and time again, is a team leader talking to their team and saying, hey guys, management or leadership people or the CEO or whoever came up with this new thing and I don't like it, but they're saying we got to do it, right? Remember what I said about the terminology about they and them versus us and we? So if there's a leadership decision that you don't like, the time to talk about it is when you're behind closed doors with your peers or with people that you report to, not when you're talking to your team. You can disagree in private, but when you go back out in public, enacting those policies, those procedures, those decisions that were made above your level, you have to give it voluntary and willing support. And here's why. It's not because you're being a company person and you're just doing whatever. It's not because of that. It's because you need to have a unified front and be sending the same message to your team. Now, obviously, it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyways. If the company or the leader is asking you to do something immoral or illegal, then that might be a hill that you should die on, right? That's one where you might say, I can't do that, I'm not going to do that, etc. But if it's not something that's immoral or illegal, you have to support it as a member of as a leader in the organization or a member of management. You have to support those decisions, because if you don't support it, how likely do you think it will be to succeed? Because at the end of the day, you want the company to succeed, you want your team to succeed, you want your boss to succeed, because that's good for you and that's good for your team. And your boss or your company is not doing these decisions because they don't like you or because they're trying to set you up for failure. They're doing it. If they are, then you should look for somewhere else to work. But 99% of the time, they are not doing that. They're doing it because they genuinely think it's a good idea. So if you go in front of your team and you say, hey guys, I don't like this decision, I don't agree with it, it's going to be a pain in the butt, it's going to be this, it's going to be that, but here's what we got to do. What have you just done to those people? You've given them your bias. So how hard are they going to try to work to make that successful? So our job as leaders is to set up the people around us for the best possible chance of success. And the way we do that is by having a unified front. Because here's the deal. If that idea was a dumb idea, a bad idea, whatever, and it doesn't work, they don't need another person telling them that it was a bad idea. They're going to see that it was a bad idea because it will be a bad idea and it won't work, right? So they're not going to continue to do bad ideas, right? And again, if your company is continuing to make decisions that cause them to lose money or lose market share or whatever, like it might be time to think about working somewhere else, right? Most companies are not doing that. They try something new and are fairly quick to understand that worked or it didn't work, right? They don't need all the naysayers to come out of the woodwork and be like, see, I told you it didn't work, right? That doesn't help anything, right? So as a leader that's dependable, which should be all of us, we need to have willing and voluntary support and set up those ideas, even the dumb ones, for the best possible chance of success. And then that way, if they fail, it wasn't because I didn't try, it was because the idea didn't work, right? And there's going to be many, many times where ideas are tried and they don't work, right? It's important to do those things because as a person or as an organization, you learn probably more from things that don't work than things that do. Like Thomas Edison said that they learned like 2,000 ways not to build a light bulb, right? And that enabled them to find the way that did, right? So it's important to think about it like that. So it's important for us to be dependable and to train our team that dependability, being reliable, is super important to our success as an individual and as an organization. So have those conversations. All right, the next one is tact. T-A-C-T, tact. So tact is the T in JJ did tie, buckle. So tact is probably not a super common English word, but it is a word and a trait that a leader should live by and embody. So here's what tact means. So tact is the ability to deal with people without causing friction or giving offense. It's the ability to do and say the right thing at the right time. This should be done with both one's leaders and one's team. So up the chain, down the chain, and across the chain, right? So tact, interacting and dealing with people without causing friction or giving offense. So some alternate words of say is like awareness of what to say and do in various situations. So for example, there might be a very delicate situation. There might be a political situation. There might be a situation that requires discretion or sensitivity or being subtle or even just straight up being polite. It's like saying please and thank you. That's part of tact, right? It's very important to treat our team with tact Be polite. Say thank you when someone does something. Say please. They know when you say, please go do this, that they need to go do that, right? Because you're their team leader or their boss or whatever. But saying please is just politeness. It's just the right thing to do. So tact is dealing with people without causing friction or giving offense. What's appropriate at a funeral for conversation is different than what's appropriate at dinner with your friends or at a locker room, or, there's different situations that require different conversation, different actions, different levels of sensitivity, of discretion, right? Now, notice what it's not saying. It's not saying that you don't ever offend someone or that you don't ever have a hard conversation with somebody about their job performance, right? It's not saying that. It's saying that you go into those conversations with the intent of not causing friction or giving offense, right? It's professionalism, really. It's just having the right conversation with the right person. You can say very hard things in an appropriate way. So telling someone that they're an idiot is not an appropriate way of trying to address their behavior. Telling them how they can improve their job performance in a professional manner with tact is an appropriate way. So being blunt or, quote unquote, I speak my mind, right? A lot of people will say that with pride, like, oh, I just say whatever I'm thinking, or I just tell people how it is, or I just speak my mind. That is the opposite of tact, and that is nothing to be proud of. Unfortunately, the tongue gets everybody in trouble more so than any other thing. So remember time and place, right? There's a time and a place for joking around, for all these different things, right? Time and a place. So tact is just recognizing the time and the place, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, being polite, being discreet. It's having the hard conversations, but it's having them in an appropriate way without trying to cause friction or give offense. Okay, so that's tact. Next one is integrity. So integrity is, you could say, it is one of the foundational principles. And again, you could say that about all of these, but people who are going around lying, cheating, stealing, those sorts of things, they're not going to be successful in the long term. They might gain short-term success by lying or doing something like that, but they're not going to be successful over the long haul. Integrity is the quality of being honest and truthful in everything one says and does. Some alternate ways to talk about it is like honesty or principle, sincerity, virtue, straightforwardness, having moral and ethical principles, character, like we've been talking about character this whole time, and integrity is a big part of that. Or even like saying that your word is your bond, or like, when you promise to do something, you follow through, right? So integrity is a very important part of building trust, building relationships with everyone in everyone in the world, up the chain of command, down the chain of command, with peers, with family, with friends. A person of integrity is trusted and respected because of their unshakable integrity of character. And people can usually end up seeing through people who have no integrity. The funny thing about people with no integrity is that oftentimes they're only fooling themselves. Most people can see right through it. And if you think you're pulling one over on somebody, you're probably not going to get away with it for long. So just have integrity, just do the right thing. It might be harder in the short term, but it's always better in the long term. Okay, so we are at the E in tie. So JJ did tie buckle, and the E is endurance. So endurance is both inward and outward strength to continue under fatigue or stress, mental endurance to think straight when fatigued, distressed, or in pain. So it's a couple things here. It's about fatigue. It's about stress. It's about inward strength or inward endurance. It's about outward strength and outward endurance. And it's about being able to think and make decisions when we're stressed, fatigued, or in pain. Pushing through hardships, lasting grit, fortitude, having mettle, perseverance, tenacity, longevity. These are things that you could say as alternate phrases for endurance. Being able to perform under stress is critical to leadership. And remember, we are all leaders and we are all going to be stressed at one point or another. So this only comes with practice, with thought, with planning, but thinking about it ahead of time so you know what to do in those situations is so important. And that's what we're doing here right now, is talking about that. So inward and outward strength, if you may have a very physically demanding job, or you may have a very low physical job, like a desk job, but either way, you're going to need endurance under fatigue and stress. Because like we talked about with fight or flight in a previous episode, everybody is going to experience it. It might be an email. It might be a comment somebody made in the hallway. It might be a text message. Could be anything that causes that stress. But understanding what you got to do and doing it is having endurance. And having mental endurance is way more important. Now, we're going to talk later in our health and wellness section about the physical side and about sleep and the importance of sleep in all of this fatigue and stress. But for right now, we're talking more heavily on the side of mental endurance or inward strength, because that is something that every single person is going to have to deal with more often than we would like. All right. The next one is bearing. So JJ did tie buckle. So we're getting close to the end here. Number 9 of 14. And buckle is the last word in JJ did tie buckle. So bearing. Bearing is the ability to look, speak, and act like a leader. To be identified or set apart from the norm, but not above. Its appearance and actions reflecting confidence, competence, alertness, and energy. So now again, notice what it's not saying. It's not saying that you have to look a certain way, or you have to dress a certain way, or you have to have a certain kind of haircut or a certain kind of suit and tie look to you. Not that there's anything wrong with any of that, but it's not saying that you have to look a certain way, but it is saying you have to act a certain way. You have to act like a leader. And acting like a leader is not standing in front of everybody and pointing at them and having that, speech that you give them on what they should be doing and how they should. No, that's not being a leader. That book I mentioned earlier, Alive and Well at the End of the Day, there's a chapter in there called Moments of High Influence. And moments of high influence are moments where the team or the people around you see something in your actions that say who you are as a leader. And oftentimes leaders think that, like, oh, when I stand in front of my team and I give them the plan of the day, that's leadership. Or a situation came up and I call everybody together and I give them a briefing or whatever, that's leadership. That's a part of leadership, but that's not a moment of high impact. The moments of high impact are things like, spilling your coffee and cleaning it up, right? Or the first time you interact with a new hire, or when they see you walking down the hallway or down the shop floor or out in the parking lot and you bend over and pick up that piece of trash that's there, and no one is around, but someone sees you from across the building or across the way. Those are moments of high influence. They're often moments that the leader doesn't even realize they're a moment of high influence. The ability to look, speak, and act like a leader. That's having bearing. This is also a big part of what is sometimes called like professionalism, right? Being confident, competent, alert, and having energy. These are all things that go into bearing. Okay. Now, it doesn't mean that anyone thinks that they're better than anybody else. That's not what bearing is about. But it's about things like posture, gestures, body language, demeanor, composure, presence, attitude. These are things that go into bearing. So there's this, I think he was a psychologist, Albert Mebraham, who come up with the 7-38-55 rule. And he says in any communication, 7% is actually what was said. 38% was tone of voice, and 55% was body language. So we have to be hyper aware of body language and tone, more so even than what is said in a communication or a conversation. And this is what I'm talking about with bearing. When you're talking with somebody, being aware of the gestures you're making or the body language or the tone of your voice, having a positive energy, alertness. These are things that show confidence, and they're actually more important in the conversation how it was said than what was said, right? Because again, you can have the hard conversation or you can have the good conversation, but it's how you deliver the message that's really what's important. Actions and appearance matter to the team, so set the example. Leaders who act emotionally or impulsively will not end up being respected. If you are the person that's constantly swearing, right, as an example, and not acting professional, you're going to get that back from your team. They're going to reflect that back to you. So it's really important to be aware of your tone, your gestures, your body language, how you listen to someone, right? If you have someone that's coming to you with an issue or something that they feel is important for them to come and address with you, and halfway through the conversation, you get a text or you get an email or something, and so your attention is diverted to your phone or to your computer, what message did you just send that person? You just sent them the message that what they're saying to you doesn't matter, and something else is more important than what they're saying. So it's really important to kind of have that notice of what is my bearing, what is my posture and my body language and my tone of voice saying to the people around me as I'm going about my day. And that's bearing. Okay, the next one is unselfishness. That's the U in buckle. So JJ did tie buckle. It's the U in buckle is unselfishness, putting the needs of the team above your own. The ability to give credit where credit is due. So there's always a balance between the mission that needs to be accomplished and the team. Usually in most civilian applications, the balance is pretty clear cut, but there may be times if you work in a hospital or first responder or something that's, life-saving, that, someone may have to risk life or limb to help someone in their job. But most jobs are not like that. Either way, being unselfish is an important leadership trait. Being able to give credit where credit is due is huge. Using terms like we and us instead of I and me kind of give away whether you're trying to get credit or you're blaming someone else because you didn't get it, right? So a team will always push themselves for a humble, unselfish leader who gives credit and doesn't seek the credit. The funny part about it is leaders who are credit hogs rarely get the credit. If somebody is only in it for themselves and they're just all about getting credit, they'll constantly finding themselves in situations where they're not getting credit because they're acting in a very selfish manner. Always give credit to the team, because guess what? The team is the people who actually did the work, right? If you're the team leader, everybody knows you're the team leader. You don't need to stand there and be like, yeah, this is what I did. My team did this. Give the credit to them. Always push it back to the team. Even and especially behind closed doors when the team is not around, because trust me, they will always find out. And if they find out that you were taking the credit or you didn't give the appropriate people the credit for their ideas, for their job, for their whatever it was, they will not respect a leader that does that. So being unselfish, pass the credit on to the team, and you don't even have to worry about that. Think about the situation as the job of the leader, we talked about this earlier, is about servant leadership. The leader is there to serve the team. The team is not there to serve the leader. The leader is there to remove roadblocks, to provide coaching and mentoring and training and budget and all this other stuff. The team is doing the work. If you're doing the work, still give credit where credit is due to other people. Okay, that's unselfishness. Next one, courage. Courage. So in the word buckle, C is the courage for JJ did tie buckle. Courage, we talked about as one of the 4 cardinal virtues already. And we talked about wisdom in JJ did tie buckle. And we talked about justice in JJ did tie buckle. So we're hitting all of these in one sense or another. So the way I explain courage in this setting is courage is the mental quality which allows one to recognize fear or stress, but enables one to succeed by being calm and acting responsible without letting emotions take over, standing up for what is right, especially when it's not popular. So standing up for what's right when it's popular, that doesn't take a lot of courage, right? Standing up for what is right when it's not popular, that takes courage. Now, this is different for every person. Some people, it might take a lot of courage for them to address a situation or speak to someone about their job performance or whatever the case may be. It might take a lot of courage, right? You still got to do it, especially if it's not popular. So alternate things would be facing difficulty, facing adversity, things like grit or spunk or tenacity. Courage, it's critical. Speaking, defending, and standing up for what's right will create value in any situation. There's a great quote from Jordan Peterson, where he says that he's talking about this sort of thing and people who have fears or aversions, is no one ever really gets less afraid of the things that they're afraid of, right? But he says, by doing therapy or by whatever means that you're getting over this fear, is you face your fear. You don't get less afraid. You get braver. But that's actually better because there's always going to be other things you can be afraid of. So courage is not the absence of fear, right? So that's what people think, like, oh, that person did this really amazing thing. They must not be afraid of that. No. It's not the absence of fear. It's facing the fear and being brave about it, right? And kind of overcoming it. But it's not, you don't ever get really less afraid of things because there's endless things that you could be afraid of. So it's about having courage. All right. So the next one is knowledge. So knowledge is the K in buckle of JJ did tie buckle. Knowledge is understanding facts or truths or principles through study, investigation, and experience. So you kind of got several ways to get it, right? You get the study, the investigation, the experience. Knowledge is about like understanding facts and truths and principles, right? Clearly understanding the truth or discerning fact or fiction, things like awareness, education, experience, grasp, insight. That's knowledge. Now, with knowledge comes confidence, right? Sometimes people will say, like, how do you get more confident? You get confident by accomplishing things, by doing things. So you can't just take a class on confidence, right? If you want to be confident, you got to find the thing that you want to be confident in, and you just got to do it a lot. You got to get the reps in. You got to get a lot of reps in. Then you will have practiced, have experience, have knowledge, and therefore will be confident. But it's the pursuit of knowledge to make yourself technically proficient that's essential in being a leader. The pursuit of knowledge. Because remember, all of these, no one has arrived, no one is perfect at all of these, and no one will ever know everything there is to know about any one subject, right? There's always something else to learn. And the more you learn about a subject, the more you realize that there's more to learn about the subject, right? So it's always about the pursuit of knowledge and knowing how to get more information or more knowledge and kind of working on your craft or getting the technical skills that you need. So there's kind of a great saying about like, you need to know a little bit about everything, but you need to be really good at least one thing, right? So that's some great career advice I was given early on, that you got to kind of know all the aspects of the business that you're in, right? If you're in production, you need to know about logistics and shipping and the leadership side and the business side and the P&L and whatever else, right? But you really need to be really good at one thing, right? But you need to have a good working knowledge of everything, right? You don't want to get so highly specialized in one thing that it kind of really limits your options. But you also, don't want to be super generic in your knowledge too, right? You need to kind of have a good working knowledge of your business. And the great way to do that is to network with your peers in those other departments or those other areas of the business and just ask questions about how can you help them? How can you set them up for success? How can you make their job easier? How can you learn about what they're doing? And you have that good, well-rounded knowledge, and then kind of have your one thing that you're pretty good at, that you're continually working on, that you like doing, and then continue to expand from there, right? So remember, knowledge in and of itself is not enough, but it is required that you start with knowledge. So if you're going to learn something, you have to learn it first, but then you got to do it. So even someone that, I'm a big believer that everybody can learn something from anybody. Anybody. You might learn what not to do from somebody, but that's still valuable information to have. You might have one person, we talked about mentorship and finding a mentor and being a mentor. You might have one person that's really good with organization, or one person that's a really good communicator, or one person, right? It's not going to always be one person that's good at everything. In fact, that'll probably never happen. But find people that are good in certain areas that you need to work on, or that you want to pick their brains and kind of develop further, and kind of have that learn something from everybody attitude. Even people that are setting a bad example, you can learn from that, and that's valuable information. You can learn what not to do. Okay, next one, loyalty. So the L in buckle, JJ did tie buckle, is loyalty. The principle of being dedicated or committed and supporting with actions. It's not enough to say you're loyal, you have to actually be loyal and act loyal. So alternate ways to look at it would be being faithfully committed to people, places, organizations, being trustworthy, being honest, having adherence to the organizational rules, things like that. Loyalty through actions will earn a lasting respect from leaders and from your team. Loyalty has to be demonstrated, not just stated. Something that I hear a lot is people saying like, "Oh, people on my team, like people have no loyalty. They just come, they go, they do this, they don't do that. And it's like, look, loyalty requires trust, which means there has to be a relationship there for there to be loyalty. And just because someone joins your team doesn't mean that they're automatically loyal to you. You have to earn that. And it's really easy to lose that trust or damage that relationship. You got to continue to work on it over time. And loyalty is a important factor to an organization, to a person, to a team. It's an important thing to be thinking about and to be acting towards, and training and mentoring folks on your team about what it's about and why it's important. A great way to do that is through the WIFM, the what's in it for me, right? Explaining to a young person who's starting an entry-level position that showing up to work on time and meeting at least the minimum standards is not just good for them and for their career and for their education and their experience long-term, but it's good for the company. And if it's good for the company, then that means the company does well, and then they have a job and they're able to buy that Xbox they were looking for, or provide from their family, or whatever their motivation is, whatever the connection point is on the why. We talked about that in a previous episode. Connect the dots there between the WIFM and loyalty, both from the company perspective, from the family perspective, or from the team perspective, whatever the case may be. It's important. All right. And the last one in JJ Did Tie Buckle, the last E is enthusiasm. Okay. So enthusiasm is the quality of tackling the job and tasks with a positive attitude and sincere interest. So just like in the Extreme Ownership series where Jocko talks about believe, as you got to believe in what you're doing in order to have someone follow what you're trying to get them to do or to communicate. You have to believe in what you're saying. Having the positive attitude and sincere interest is how you become enthusiastic about the subject that you're talking about. So alternate ways you can think about this is interest or pursuit, passion, energy, devotion, spirit, enjoyment, optimistic, vigor, gusto, zest. More importantly, the can-do attitude that we've talked about previously, right? Remember the 75-25, 75% of success is determined by your can-do attitude. Enthusiasm. So positive attitudes, or being enthusiastic about the job or about being the leader of that team or organization or family or whatever it is, having a positive attitude is contagious. Having a negative attitude is even more contagious. So having a close-knit team, if that's what you want to build, you need to have enthusiasm. You need to have sincere interest and a positive attitude, which that's what enthusiasm means in this instance. You have to have that. You have to be genuine. You have to believe in what you're doing if you want your team to also take on those positive attributes. Negativity will always tear a team apart. It just always happens. Nobody can perform in a negative environment to their full potential. So having enthusiasm is one of the core 14 leadership traits according to the Marine Corps leadership training on JJ Did Tie Buckle. So there's a great quote from Marcus Aurelius in Meditations where he says, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be, and just be one." And I love that sentiment because we've been talking for a while now on this podcast about wisdom, about virtue and excellence and the pursuit of personal character or character development or organizational excellence. You could call it a bunch of different things. But at the end of the day, now that you've been empowered with this information, right? Anybody who's listened to this, now that you have this information, now the onus is on you to do it. So like Marcus said, waste no more time arguing about what a good person should be, and just be one. Similar to the quote from Gandhi where he says, be the change that you want to see. If you want your team to take ownership, you need to take ownership. If you want them to be enthusiastic, you need to be enthusiastic. If you want them to be dependable, you have to be dependable to them. If you want them to act with integrity, you have to show them integrity. So waste no more time, just be one. Thank you for listening. I appreciate everybody. If you made it this far, then you are very serious about character development and the pursuit of excellence. So I applaud you for that. And please share this with your friends. Subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you on the next episode.